Staying with us, the United Nations Security Council has passed a resolution demanding that Afghanistan's territory not be used to threaten or attack any country or to shelter and train terrorists, a decision that came just as the United States completed its military evacuation at Kabul's international airport, passing with 13 votes in favor and over 2 abstentions from Russia and China. The text also called for strengthened efforts to provide humanitarian assistance in the country, affirming the importance of upholding human rights while pressing the Taliban to uphold commitments to allow Afghans the ability to travel abroad at any time of their choosing.
The resolution, which was co-sponsored by the United States, the United Kingdom, France and Ireland, gives clear direction to the Taliban on what the international community expects from it as the de facto rulers of Afghanistan, and in lieu of what many here hope will lead to a future inclusive government that includes women.
The Security Council is called to order.
Regional powerhouse India currently chairs the UN Security Council.
The resolution also recognizes the importance of upholding human rights, especially of Afghan women, children and minorities, as well as to inclusive negotiated settlement and to humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. These are some of the key aspects of the resolution which have been highlighted by India. Needless to say, the adoption of the resolution is a strong signal from the Security Council and the international community on its expectations in respect of Afghanistan.
The United States welcomed the passage of the text despite the Council's inability to reach consensus on all its elements.
The Security Council expects the Taliban to live up to its commitment to facilitate safe passage for Afghans and foreign nationals who want to leave Afghanistan today as well as going forward. Second, the Taliban and all parties need to facilitate humanitarian assistance, and humanitarian actors must be given full, safe and unhindered access to continued service delivery to those in need. And third, the Security Council reiterates its enduring call on the importance of counterterrorism, respecting human rights, including those of women, girls, and minorities.
Abstentions?
Both Russia and China abstained in the vote on the resolution, with Beijing criticizing the hasty withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan, while expressing hopes that lessons had been learned in truly respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of that country.
China has huge doubt about the necessity and urgency of adopting this resolution and a balance of its content. Despite this, China has still participated constructively in the consultations and put forward important and reasonable amendments together with Russia. Unfortunately, our amendments have not been fully adopted. China has always opposed to imposing or forcibly pushing for resolution by any sponsors. Based on the above considerations, China has abstained from this draft resolution.
The resolution did not include a reference to establishing a safe zone in Kabul, which had been mooted by European countries. This would have provided safe passage to people seeking to leave Afghanistan, a responsibility that now falls entirely to the Taliban and its internal processes. All this as General Frank McKenzie of the U.S. Central Command confirmed that the U.S. military had completed the withdrawal of its forces from Afghanistan, in effect ending America's longest-running war. Sherman Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Our question of the day is related to that story, where we're asking you what your thoughts are about America's evacuation of Afghanistan and the way forward for that country. A few tweets have come through. Let's take a look at them. Temba Tuvuka says, good morning to the crew and viewers. I'm definitely shocked by that U.S. military withdrawals from Afghanistan. And Khuto Mamabolo saying the U.S. military mission in Afghanistan had to come to an end at some point, whether it's a failure or not. The bottom line is that they could not stay there indefinitely. And of course, we're continuing, and at the end of the chaotic evacuation, the US and its allies have left Afghanistan after almost 20 years of war. The Taliban forces are now in charge for the first time in almost 2 decades, but the future is unknown for who's left behind. For more on this, we're joined by Sami Hamdi. Sami is the editor-in-chief for the International Interest. Very good morning, and good morning in South Africa. What time is it where you are, Sami?
Yeah, we are 1 hour ahead, 1 hour behind, sorry, UK, London. So it's not still morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. Have the American allies left Afghanistan fixed or broken?
I think it's important to stress that what was taking place in Afghanistan, first and foremost, was an occupation. It was a US occupation of Afghanistan. It was an entry by the US in the spirit of revenge for what had taken place in 9/11. So when the US is leaving now, they're leaving a broken Afghanistan. They're leaving an Afghanistan that they were unable to fix, if we want to use that word. They're leaving an Afghanistan that is devoid of any real credible institutions that are worth defending, institutions that the Afghan army, that more than $1 trillion, $1 trillion was spent on, did not believe was worth defending, that an army that had been trained for 20 years did not believe that the American project was worth defending, and they surrendered, many of them, to the Taliban. So when the US are withdrawing now, the US are withdrawing ignominiously, they're withdrawing humiliated, they're withdrawing defeated, they're withdrawing having achieved none of the objectives, and this has been rather emphasized by the recent attacks by the terrorist group ISIS-K, in that even when Biden has tried to rewrite the history of the US mission in Afghanistan, even when Biden has sought to assert that the mission was never to build a state, it was never to impose democracy, the mission was only to fight terrorism, and in Biden's words, they succeeded in fighting terrorism. 2 days after Biden makes this speech in which he tries to rewrite the history of the US mission in Afghanistan, ISIS-K launched a terrorist attack to show the world full on just the extent to which the US failed at every level and failed to achieve any of their objectives in terms of what they were trying to achieve in Afghanistan. And I think that speaks volumes as to the state of Afghanistan today and where Afghanistan might be headed forward. In that while now what we're seeing is a rather revisionist approach now in Afghanistan, this idea perhaps that the US were doing good in Afghanistan. I think what emphasizes the nature of the US occupation of Afghanistan, and what also emphasizes the manner in which Afghanistan has been broken, not just by the Taliban before, but also by the US, is that Biden's response to the ISIS-K terrorist attack was to launch a drone strike in which Afghan children were killed, but the focus has been on the death of US Marines and not on these Afghan children who are killed, almost as if the emphasis is uniquely on how the US feels and not how the Afghans feel, who suffered under the Taliban from 1996 to 2001, but also suffered for 20 years under a US occupation that failed to deliver the very necessities of the institutions that Afghans badly needed, be it in terms of opportunities in employment, healthcare, even in the case of women's rights, in which everybody is talking about. The reality is that it is an emphatic failure. Afghanistan is broken, but at least now the Afghans have some sort of agency to build a country between themselves, as opposed to waiting for an occupier to do it for them.
You talk about a revisionist approach, but these attacks by ISIS, will these hamper the Taliban's efforts at self-determination?
I think they will hamper the Taliban's efforts at self-determination, not necessarily because they will create this security problem, but because it will give a reason for the US, for France, and for Europe to stay in Afghanistan, to strong-arm the Taliban, to force the Taliban essentially to prevent them from fully exerting their right to self-determination, to strong-arm the Taliban by resisting their attempts to secure international recognition. I think therein lies the problem. And the irony of what the ISIS-K is doing is that ISIS-K is trying to keep the occupation in Afghanistan. ISIS-K, which claims that it wants the US out, wants the US to stay because it's terrified that it is not going to be the prime beneficiary of the US leaving, and that it is rather the Taliban who is the sworn enemy of ISIS-K who is going to benefit. And this is why when we're looking at what Afghanistan is taking place today, it appears that we're still not learning the lessons. We're still looking at Afghanistan through the terrorism lens that the US looked at Afghanistan through when it invaded in 2001. We're still looking at Afghanistan through the security lens as opposed to the social, political, and economic lens that the Afghans want to be seen through. The reality is that when you look at it, the US looked at Afghanistan for 20 years through a security lens. Security was the priority. And that meant that everything else took a back seat. And what that meant was the US established a government that was so corrupt that none of the Afghans wanted to defend it. And instead, they gave up and said, listen, it can't be as bad as the Taliban. And the Taliban were able to storm through Afghanistan and eventually take Kabul. And this is what is worrying, in that 20 years on and we're still not learning the lessons. 20 years on and we're still focusing on the same angles that we've been focusing on the last 20 years, as opposed to the real crux of the issue, which is national reconciliation, which is justice, which is good governance, all of these which have the potential to weaken ISIS-K and weaken terrorism. If the aim of the terrorists is to keep the US in Afghanistan, it may well be they will win in this if Biden succumbs to it and doesn't find this ability to work with the Taliban that is badly needed, and that the Pentagon officials themselves are beginning to say is a necessity if they want to achieve the security aims of the US in Afghanistan.
Of course, in the aftermath, different countries are scouring for different ways to approach developments in Afghanistan. For argument's sake, Zamir Kabulov, who's the Russian representative in Afghanistan, in Kabul, has been said on Monday that they were working to establish relations with Afghanistan's new Taliban rulers, while at the same time, Russian forces are forming at the border with Afghanistan. How should different countries around the world be approaching this international relations development in Afghanistan?
I think the biggest issue for Russia, Pakistan, India, the US, China, Iran, and some of these other countries that bar the US neighbor, Afghanistan, the problem is the nature in which the Taliban have come to power. The way the Taliban have come to power is in a very unique fashion compared to the other powers that are in the region, in that the Taliban enjoy a very unique agency, in that the Taliban actually have room to be able to assert themselves in the interest of the Taliban or in the interest of Afghanistan if you really want to push it. And for the viewers who want to understand what I mean, when you look at, for example, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Biden can very easily force him to stop the war in Yemen, force him to reconcile with Qatar, force him to do things that he would otherwise not want to do. Biden can force Qatar to take in Afghan refugees, can force Qatar to reconcile with the UAE, can force Qatar to back down in Libya or the like, even if Qatar does not want to. Biden has that power over these countries to make them do things that they don't want to do. But unlike these countries, the Taliban have a unique agency in that their power is so entrenched in Afghanistan that they're able to assert themselves in their own right. And that's what Russia, China, Iran, and the others are very uncomfortable about. Because when you pull out a map and you see where Afghanistan is, it is in such a geostrategic location that it cannot be ignored. But the Taliban are not a proxy of any particular country. Even though they've been supported by Pakistan, this doesn't mean that they are a proxy of Pakistan. And Pakistan themselves are worried about the trajectory the Taliban might go forward, because the Pakistan always wanted Afghanistan to be a sort of weapon to use against India, not to be an independent state in and of itself. So Russia is pursuing Afghanistan or looking at Afghanistan through this angle, in that the Taliban are very difficult to pressure. It's very difficult to exercise leverage over the Taliban. And this is why the Russians are sort of saying, okay, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's clear that the Taliban have just defeated the US. It's clear that the US are going to try to strong arm the Taliban. I am myself, I'm worried about the US. Let me therefore go and try to woo the Taliban, try to win the Taliban as an ally, and thereby I might be able to get one up against the Americans. China, it's the same process. I don't like the Americans. I don't want the Americans to have a foothold. They're frustrating me through India. Let me therefore woo the Taliban, give them what they want, which is economic packages, which is international recognition, which is diplomatic ties. Let me do that while Europe and America are ignoring the Taliban, and therefore I can win Afghanistan and I can push back against the Americans. This is why we see the Russians, on the one hand, they're sending troops to the border almost in a fear of what the fallout of Afghanistan, how that might impact Russia. But at the same time, it's going above and beyond to say to the Taliban, listen, even if Biden and the EU are antagonistic towards you, we are ready to work with you. We are ready to recognize you. And the only condition that we have is that you don't ally with the Americans and you help us to push back against the Americans. This is the approach that the Russians are taking.
How should African countries be engaging with these developments?
I think the most controversial aspects of what's taking place in Afghanistan have more to do with the PR narrative that has been fed with regards to Afghanistan, as opposed to the actual realities that took place on the ground. And the reason I say this is that for 20 years, we were told that the Taliban are terrorists. And then when ISIS-K committed their attack, it's clear for the US, the Taliban is no longer a terrorist group, but rather a potential partner in the fight against terrorism. In other words, when they were fighting one another, they were throwing accusations at each other. When they are no longer fighting one another, now suddenly they can become partners. So I think when African nations are looking at Afghanistan, I think it's important for African nations to talk of Afghanistan as it is, as opposed to how it was presented. They should talk about Afghanistan as it is in terms of its realities, as opposed to how it's been presented in the media narratives. And I'll give one example for the viewers, in that a lot of the concern about Afghanistan is not as a result of things that are actually taking place on the ground, but rather fears about what happened before. In other words, for example, the idea that perhaps girls won't be allowed for education is because in '96, the Taliban didn't allow education for girls, not because the Taliban have done anything in the past few weeks to suggest they won't give education for girls. When we're talking about the Taliban committing revenge attacks, these are not based on what's actually happening on the ground. These are based on what took place in '96, but not based on any evidence of what's taking place in Afghanistan at the moment. In other words, my point is that a lot of the concerns are built out of fears of what might happen, not fears as a result of what has happened in recent times over the past few weeks or over the past few months. And the reason I mention this is that for the African states, it's important to be aware that if you're going to follow the US position is changing based on the realpolitik, based on the dynamics on the ground. When the US was fighting the Taliban, they were terrorists. When the US now is retreating and defeated, it is now going to pursue ties with the Taliban. So if you're always following the US line on it, you're going to be way behind the pecking order in terms of Afghanistan, which has its resources, which is looking for international recognition and the like. If we're talking about the African citizen and how they're looking to Afghanistan, I think that the African citizen should approach it in the same way they would explore Vietnam, in the same way they would approach any country that has sought liberation from a colonial power. This idea that the Americans went in, they tried to impose social engineering, they went in by force, irrespective of the woes of the Taliban. But the Americans removed that Afghan agency. They installed a puppet government. They installed a government that was corrupt, that the Afghans themselves did not want. For them, women's rights was about putting a skirt on a woman and putting a t-shirt, as opposed to real education, as opposed to real development, as opposed to real employment opportunities, as opposed to real access to healthcare and the like, all of which were not provided under the Afghan government. And this is why I think that when Africans are looking to what's taking place in Afghanistan, they should be looking at it from the same lens that they look at African countries. This idea that what African states want more than anything is agency, is the right to self-determination, and they should be supporting Afghans' rights to self-determination, even if it perhaps looks different from that which they expect. The reality of the situation is this, in that America had 20 years and achieved nothing. It's clear it didn't work. It's clear the military effort didn't work. It's clear the Americans in their social engineering experiment didn't work. It's clear none of the aims were achieved. It's now time to create an environment in which we allow the Afghans to pursue a national reconciliation, in which we allow the Afghans to decide how they want to be ruled. It's now a time in which we help the Afghans to form their own state, and to form a state in a manner that they envisage, not necessarily something that we superimpose in the manner that the US tried to do for 20 years.
Sami, we can't entirely say that the concerns are based on fears. I mean, the whole world knows the story of Malala Yousafzai, although it was in a different country, but she was attacked by the Taliban. The narrative that a government by the Taliban will reverse 2 decades of the recognition of women and the recognition of human rights and political freedoms. Are you concerned about this?
I think there are many concerns with regards to the Taliban. I think many have concerns with regards to their approach to women's rights. I think many have concerns with regards to their approach towards allowing women to work, in terms of allowing women to roam the streets, allowing women to express themselves. I think there are many concerns about that. But the reason I say that they are based on fears and not realities is because what we are seeing at the moment is a very different Taliban in terms of its rhetoric, a very different Taliban in terms of their approach, a very different Taliban in terms of how they're approaching their politics. Let's remember that in 1996, when the Taliban entered Kabul, they dragged out the President Najibullah, who was in the United Nations office. They tortured him and they executed him, and they continued to embark on revenge attacks. This hasn't happened this time when, in terms of the Taliban entering Kabul. When we saw the Taliban enter in 1996, there was no attempt to engage in national reconciliation. There was no attempt to engage other parties outside the Taliban. There was no attempt to form a unity government. It was all about superimposing the Taliban. This time we're seeing the Taliban running to engage with Hamid Karzai, with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, with Abdullah, these prominent Afghan politicians. We're seeing the Taliban take the Doha mediation seriously in terms of talking with the US. We're seeing from CNN reports and other established journalists that the Taliban forces in Kabul are disciplined and they are not transgressing against women, not transgressing against even people who are smoking or people doing things perhaps that the Taliban deem to be un-Islamic. And this is what I mean, in that the fears are based on the Taliban of old, not based on the actions of the Taliban over the past few weeks or over the past few months that have essentially surprised everybody and have given rise to a statement by the UK Chief of Defence Staff in which he says that, yes, it appears the Taliban appear different, and it may well be that we need to give them the space and time to really show whether they actually mean it this time. In other words, he has the assumption or the presumption that the Taliban, from what he is seeing, they are operating in a very different way from how they did before. And this is what I mean by that the old Taliban committed those atrocities against Malala Yousafzai and the like. But it's clear this is a different generation. This is a Taliban that, at least for now, not based on actions, but based on the absence of the actions they committed before, it's clear that this is a very different Taliban. But my point here is not necessarily that the Taliban, whether the Taliban are good or bad. I don't think that anybody can make that conclusion. We haven't seen anything from the Taliban that might suggest they're going to be good. All we've seen is perhaps that there are some marked differences. My point here is this, in that if your argument is that the Taliban won't bring the rights for women and the like, the reality is that this is still taking place within an Afghan environment. But what is abundantly clear is that the US could not deliver it. The US could not impose those developments. The US could not provide Afghanistan with the necessary development that it needed in terms of its democratic transition, or even with regards to women's rights. When we're talking about the advancement of women's rights in Afghanistan, the reality is that we should not paint this rosy picture in that the US achieved some mighty achievement. The US did not. And the reality is that the government remained corrupt. There was still nepotism. Jobs were secured by nepotism, not by meritocracy. And just because you had a few women presenting on television without the headscarf, that doesn't mean necessarily that this was an advancement for women's rights. That's something perhaps might have painted a rosy picture, but the reality, the substance underneath was non-existent. And what I'm saying, my point is not that the Taliban are going to be better than the US, but rather that Afghanistan's development is dependent upon the Afghans agreeing between themselves and the Afghans exercising the right to self-determination, not a foreign occupier occupying the country militarily and dictating to them how it should be done. We've tried the military occupation approach. The Soviets tried it until 1989. The Americans tried it from 2001 to 2021. It's clear that if you're worried about women's rights, it's not going to come from the US It's not going to come from military occupation. It's not going to come from US social engineering. It's going to come through applying pressure on Afghans, applying pressure on the Taliban, promoting this national reconciliation process that we're seeing take place in Afghanistan. And if the Taliban fail, and they may well fail, if the Taliban decide to renege on women's rights, which they may well renege on women's rights, it's about empowering Afghans to do the change, empowering Afghans to be able to make those changes, not to bring in a foreign power again, to destroy the country, to bomb it to oblivion, and then ask them to implement something that we know they cannot, will not, and will be unable to implement.
Clearly a complex situation, but finally let's just talk about another stakeholder in this whole program. Afghanistan is endowed with mining prowess, petroleum, natural gases. I imagine that potential investors and people who'd like to do business with the country are looking from the outside and looking to see how to operate with the Taliban in this regard. Is Afghanistan open for business?
I think at this moment in time, there's a lack of clarity over the trajectory that the Taliban will go. The Taliban have not formed the government yet. The process of forming a government is becoming a bit complicated as the Taliban try to bring the parties together in order to form this government. The Taliban themselves are a coalition of different factions and groups, and trying to balance between them is quite difficult as well. But I think the primary obstacle at this moment in time to any business initiatives in Afghanistan is Biden. I think the world now is looking to Biden and waiting to see if he will recognize the Taliban, or if he will impose sanctions on Afghanistan and strangle it in the manner that he strangles Iran, in a sort of revenge for the US defeat, or rather to prevent Afghanistan from going into the arms of China or going into the arms of Russia. I think the Taliban are trying to pursue good ties with the US, and I think part of the reason they're doing that is because they're terrified that Biden will impose these sanctions on Afghanistan and essentially choke the country and prevent any form of development. So I think until it becomes clear what Biden intends to do with Afghanistan, whether he intends to work with the Taliban, I don't think necessarily that businesses are going to be rushing in. I think also that while there's talk that China might invest in Afghanistan, I think it's important to stress that the Afghans don't want to be involved in China's debt trap. They want essentially to have better conditions than what China perhaps has provided to many of the African states. I think also the Afghanistan or the Taliban are trying to assess the talent pool in Afghanistan and whether they are able to extract some of their resources by themselves. But I think the easiest or the simplest answer to your question is nothing is clear until we know exactly what Biden intends. The reality is that the Pentagon might be arguing that the Taliban should be recognized and that they should be working with them. But I think that given the current climate, I think the US is still engaged in this revisionist narrative. It's engaged in trying to retell the story of Afghanistan in order to stop people from saying that the US were defeated. Biden is waiting for a more conducive environment. And I think perhaps the process of recognition may well be accelerated, given that France is trying to barge into the lead. The UK is trying to barge into the lead on Afghanistan, and Biden may well seek to impose US hegemony once more by saying to these countries, move out of the way. I'm the one who decides. I will work with the Taliban through Qatar, through Pakistan and the like, and I will try to get the Taliban to stand against China, stand against Russia as Biden makes that pivot against China. But everything is still unclear until the Taliban form a government and until Biden's position is made clear.
Sami Hamdi is the editor-in-chief of the International Interest. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Obviously, a complex story that is developing as well. We're going to take you live now to KZN Bonginkosi Kanyile.